Welcome, everybody. This is Matt Lasav, Vice President for Marketing at ExecOnline. We are currently waiting for the remainder of our guests to join. The webinar will begin in 2 minutes. Welcome again, everybody. This is Matt Lasav, Vice President for Marketing here at ExecOnline. We are so pleased to have everyone join us today to talk about this highly relevant topic. Our data shows that 78% of companies like yours anticipate making strategic changes because of Trump's elections. Yet most of those same companies are unprepared to make and implement the necessary changes, so there's a contradiction. Our webinar today will cover the type of strategic shifts that companies are making, as well as the actions you can take to more effectively manage change and lead within your organization. For those of you who haven't worked with ExecOnline in the past, what we do is we enable enterprises to rapidly deliver leadership development that creates lasting organizational value. Our programs are designed to drive business impact, resulting in twice the effectiveness of standard leadership programs. Specifically, we partner with elite business schools like Columbia, Yale, Berkeley, and MIT to create university-certified leadership development programs delivered through our proprietary cloud-based platform. Our technology and reach to more than 130 enterprise clients with more than 6,000 program graduates enables us to collect the data supporting this webinar today. ExecOnline is headquartered in New York with offices here in California and in Washington, D.C. The webinar today will be hosted by Michael Griffin, Chief Enterprise Products Officer based in Washington, D.C. Mike is responsible for all the enterprise products and services that surround our programs, including the work that we do around analytics and measurement, and our work with alumni. Mike has more than 15 years experience advising C-level Fortune 500 executives on talent and finance performance strategies. Some quick logistics before we start. One, your microphones and phones are currently set to mute. Please do leave them on mute for the duration of the webinar. Two, we will be conducting a Q&A following the presentation. However, do feel free to message your questions to the organizers team directly in the chat box located in your webinar control panel at any time. And if you find that the webinar control panel is distracting, you can click on the orange collapse arrow located in your webinar control panel. Click on the same arrow again to open it back up. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us here today. I'll turn it over to Mike Griffin, Chief Enterprise Product Officer. Mike?
Thanks, Matt, and thank you all for joining us today to discuss the implications of the Trump election for business leaders. This is clearly a top-of-mind issue for corporate executives. It's almost impossible to avoid, right? Especially in this age of social media, we're inundated daily with news, reactions, opinions, and punditry related to the Trump election and presidency. We took a snapshot here of the CNBC website last week, which of course it's a business news site, not a general news site or a political news site. And you can see that no less than 5 of the business stories on the front page were all about Trump. And we could have picked any day of the week. We didn't cherry pick this day, and you'd see a very, very similar pattern. The business agenda and news cycle is being dominated right now by politics, and specifically by Trump. We're being bombarded with a constant stream of Trump-related headlines and information. How do we as leaders separate signal from noise? And how do we help our teams move forward in the right direction with confidence, given all of this noise? So that's what we're going to talk about today in our call. And I want to start by sharing a little bit of a story. I want to take us back to World War II. The US military was facing a real problem with its bombers. Too many bombers were getting shot down and they weren't returning. And so they wanted to figure out where to put additional armor on their planes. Now, these are planes, right? They're not tanks. They couldn't simply add more armor everywhere. That would dramatically reduce the range and the flying performance of the planes. So they needed to be very targeted in where they added the armor. So the Center for Naval Assessments commissioned a study of all the planes that came back to see where the bullet holes and the shrapnel damage was located on the planes so they could then decide where to reinforce them. And they commissioned a Hungarian mathematician then to use that data and determine where future planes should be reinforced before being sent out again. Now, I want you to take a close look at the image, which shows the bullet patterns that they observed. I'm going to ask you all to tell me, where do you think they decided to add reinforcement? Where would you add the reinforcement to the bombers? And I think this will be a good test of our chat functionality. Type in the chat box your answer. Where would you add armor to the bomber based upon the pattern that you see here on the screen? Great, I'm seeing a few different answers here. So a few different answers: pilot controls and propulsion, undercarriage, pilot hatch, cockpit. Yeah, well, a couple of you got it. It's really interesting. And thank you for participating and testing out the chat functionality for us. Well, Abraham Wald, the Hungarian statistician, he had a very powerful insight, which was counterintuitive. The planes should be reinforced where there are no bullet holes, right? Because the planes they studied were the ones that came back. The ones they studied were the planes that survived. He correctly inferred that the that the areas of the plane that weren't hit, those were the areas that would cause the bombers to go down. So in this case, as a couple of you pointed out correctly, it was the forward cockpit and the front engines. And so that's where they added the extra armor, saving countless bombers and pilot lives. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we as leaders focus on what matters. Much like that Hungarian statistician, how do we identify the signal and ignore all of the noise in the current environment? So with that in mind, let me share with you our key findings and recommendations. And I want to start by showing you where we're headed today. These are the key findings and recommendations coming out of our research and our survey of executives on the Trump election. And we're going to spend some time on each of these and really unpack them. But I wanted to give you a peek at where we're headed. At the top, you can see the main finding from our survey of leaders like yourselves. 78% of leaders anticipate significant change, but few organizations are prepared. They lack the flexibility to adapt to changes that we're anticipating. And then below are 3 key recommendations for how to position your organizations for success in this environment. First, focus on talent, not just scenario planning. Scenario planning is critical, but we also need to have clear talent strategies to take advantage of changing priorities in the Trump era. Second, think strategically about how you spend your time. The most critical, the scarcest resource, arguably, that you have as a leader is your time. And as we talk about things to focus more on, we also want you to think about what you're going to spend less time on. And then finally, focus on intelligent risk-taking. We need to play offense in this environment. We can't sit on our hands. But how do we do that in a smart way, given all the risks that are out there? So again, that's where we're headed. We like to start with the end in mind here. And now we have a number of HR and learning leaders on the line with us today as well. And as we go through these findings, for those of you in the HR and learning function, think about the implications for your leadership development programs. So for example, do you have programs that support change readiness and agility that organizations will need to succeed in this environment? Do we understand the talent needs as shifting strategies evolve in the current environment, how we align our development interventions with those priorities? And we think about the need for intelligent risk-taking and the competencies of our leaders. Where are they likely to excel and where are they likely to fall short at your organization? Okay, before we dive in, I want to share a few ground rules for the call. 3 key rules to help us get the most out of this conversation. And we really want this to be an excellent use of your time. So a few guidelines that we think will make this very productive. First is contribution. We have more than 100 executives from the world's leading organizations joining us today, and we really want to tap into that experience and perspective that you all bring to the table. So we're going to ask you to use the checkbox, and we'll have a few polls as well. We want this to be interactive, and I think we're off to a great start already, so thank you for that. Second, and this goes hand in hand with the first ground rule, confidentiality. You will not see us attribute any comments or poll responses you make to you as an individual or to your organization. We'll only share a high-level playback document. And we'd ask that you extend that same courtesy to your peers as well. And our third ground rule is particularly important given the political nature of the topic that we're discussing today and the diversity and strength of perspectives on this topic. As we think about the implications of the Trump election for leaders, we really want to adopt a business and economic lens for our conversation today, as opposed to a social or political lens. And we've tried to be as dispassionate as possible in evaluating the business and economic implications for leaders. And we ask you to try and do the same as well in this conversation. We think it'll lead to a much more productive conversation. So let's take a look at our agenda. 3 conversations we want to have. First, the leadership environment. How is the Trump election impacting the environment that we all operate in? We want to take some time in this section to really understand the risks, opportunities, and the challenges for you as leaders. And then in the second section, leadership activities. We'll look at how leaders are responding. What are the right activities to focus on to set yourself and your teams up for success? And how do you manage your time to achieve that? And finally, leadership competencies. What are the individual skills and behaviors that become particularly important in this environment? And this is where we'll talk about intelligent risk-taking. So we talked already about the key recommendations coming out of our research, and we're going to uncover those recommendations across these 3 conversations. So let's dive in and start by looking at the leadership environment. We're operating in an environment with much more confidence and much more uncertainty. It's a little bit of a paradox, right, in that we typically see that more uncertainty undermines confidence, but that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing both more confidence about upside opportunities and more uncertainty about downside risks. And you see a couple of quotes on the page that illustrate this dynamic with the stock price of the S&P 500 as a backdrop. We see a significant uptick in investor confidence following the November 8th election. And we pulled out one quote on the bottom left that we think is representative of this perspective. The quote is from Stanley Druckenmiller, a legendary billionaire hedge fund investor, well known in the investor community for making a big bet on the stock market on the night of the election. And you see the quote that explains his thinking. I'll just read it. This economy is so overregulated and people are just drowning in red tape that the removal of that, and I'm expecting serious tax reform, cuts to the corporate tax rate, so I'm quite optimistic on the economy. This is representative of the confidence that we're seeing among investors. And there's clearly a sense that Trump's policies are on balance pro-growth and pro-market. And it's not just investors. We see CEO and consumer confidence numbers up as well since the election, even with some pullback on the consumer side in January. Overall, there's still clearly heightened confidence. At the same time, there's a lot more uncertainty. There's a sense that we're seeing significant shifts in policy and the business environment, and there's a sense that the range of potential outcomes that could arise from the Trump administration and the policies associated with it has grown dramatically. The quote from one of our survey participants, I think, captures that sentiment quite nicely. Market uncertainty is the main impact of the election for our organization. It has emphasized the need to control costs and reduce unnecessary spending. It requires a high degree of discipline and analysis of what costs stay or go. And so, as leaders, we must operate in an environment of greater confidence and greater uncertainty. And I want to pause here and get a sense for how this has changed, if at all, in the past 2 weeks since the Trump inauguration. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up a quick poll. And the question is, since the inauguration, have you grown more or less confident in your business outlook? And we have a few choices for you here, ranging from less confident at the top, somewhat less confident, neutral, somewhat more confident, or more confident. We'll give folks a chance to respond. See a few still trickling in here. We're at 68% of folks voting. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here, and let's take a look and see what the results are. All right, very interesting distribution here. So on average, more confidence in the last 2 weeks since the inauguration, perhaps reflecting some of the momentum behind some of the policies that folks are expecting. So 31% somewhat more confident, 19% more confident fully, 31% sort of sitting in the middle, and only 20% of folks somewhat or less confident. Great. All right. Thank you for sharing that. I have one more question to ask here related to what's changed since the election. We talked about confidence. Let's take a look at your level of concern about risk and uncertainty. Okay, I'm going to launch our second poll here. Since the inauguration, have you grown more or less concerned about business risk and business uncertainty? I'll give folks a chance to respond to this as well. Range of choices from less concerned through to more concerned about uncertainty. Great, I see responses coming in here. 77% of folks have voted. Let's close and take a look at the results. Okay, again, very interesting here. On balance, more concern about uncertainty. So I think we're seeing both more confidence and more concern just in the last 2 weeks, an acceleration of the existing trends. So here, 48% saying somewhat more concerned, 13% more concerned. So majority of folks are seeing more concern and uncertainty, 23% neutral, and only 16% less concerned. Great, well, thank you for sharing that. I think helpful to see as we're operating in a very dynamic environment, kind of up to the minute, how leaders or peers are kind of perceiving the current landscape. There's another key factor as well that we hear a lot from executives that makes leading in this environment very unique, we think. There's clearly strong divisions in terms of how individuals perceive the current administration. And we see that playing out among employees as well as customers. And this can play out very painfully for our organizations. I think we see this very clearly with Uber the ride-sharing company, more than $1 billion in revenue. A segment of their customers started boycotting the app because of perceived alignment between the CEO and Trump's agenda. It started because Uber kept its prices low when taxis were boycotting picking up passengers from Kennedy Airport to protest the travel restrictions. And there was a big social media campaign to delete the app. And of course, their big competitor, Lyft, jumped in to try and take advantage of this, making a very public donation to the ACLU in solidarity with the protesters. As a result, Uber CEO is now stepping back from the president's advisory council to try and distance himself. And now customers who are Trump supporters are having their own boycotting campaign to delete the app because in their eyes, the CEO has flip-flopped and kind of waded into a political debate. Now, you can debate the merits of different brand strategies, but this clearly is not the position that any of us want to be in. And this is really the peril of navigating through an environment where we have these very fundamental divisions among both customers and employees. So we want to understand how are leaders responding to these challenges. And we surveyed more than 100 executives that we work with. And as Matt mentioned at the beginning of the call, we're really privileged to work with thousands of senior executives from the world's leading organizations, many of whom are on the call today, who go through our digital leadership development programs with top business schools. And we surveyed more than 240 of these executives from US headquartered companies about the impact of the election, the business impact of the election. Some were based in international locations, but all from US headquartered companies. And we asked them, where are you seeing opportunity or risk? What decisions are you changing? What activities are you focusing on? On the bottom left, you can see we had a very nice cross-functional representation. On the top right, you can see that we also had participants across a wide spectrum of industries. And then on the bottom right, you can see our focus is really on senior leaders. Most are at that director or VP level. So 47% senior directors or directors, 10% senior vice presidents or vice presidents. So a really nice sample of leaders at US headquartered organizations. And we started by asking those leaders to evaluate a list of 18 different scenarios that might play out as a result of Trump's election. We looked at 5 categories of scenarios: macroeconomic scenarios, America First scenarios, limited government scenarios, talent scenarios, and fiscal stimulus. And so you see what we tried to do here is have a balance of both upside and downside scenarios. So if we look at macroeconomic scenarios on the top left, for example, we looked at macroeconomic instability, elevated inflation, increases in the cost of borrowing, strengthening of the US currency, faster economic growth in the US, and increased geopolitical conflict. Now, whether something is positive or negative might depend, of course, on your industry and your business, but the point is we wanted to capture both sides of the risk equation, both the good and the bad. And what we wanted to do first was get a sense for the likelihood of those scenarios. And what really jumped out to us here was that leaders grade nearly 90% of the scenarios as likely or possible, hence the title, Bracing for Change. The consensus, which I think has been reinforced by what we've seen in the past week and the polling that we just did here, is that we are in store for a good deal of change. And let me orient you to the graphic. It shows the percentage of respondents who say that each scenario was highly likely or likely in our survey. So the first bar, for example, tells us that 85% of executives believe that increased barriers to immigration are likely or highly likely. And of course, we've already seen an executive order taken on this issue in the current battle in the courts. So as we look across the range of scenarios, a strong sense that these scenarios are somewhat likely. Even the 2 that are labeled unlikely on the far right, macroeconomic instability and decreased enforcement of labor laws, they still had more than 30% of respondents grade them as likely. So these are not black swan, once in 100-year type possibilities or risks. But we don't just care about the likelihood of the scenarios. We also want to understand their impact on our businesses, right? So the extent to which they're positive or negative. Let's advance forward 1 slide. And what we see here is that leaders are most optimistic about limited government and fiscal stimulus scenarios. In general, most leaders believe that limited government and fiscal stimulus scenarios are both likely and would have a positive impact for their companies. You see those scenarios clustered in the top right quadrant of the 2x2. Our vertical axis here indicates whether the scenario is perceived to have a positive versus negative impact, and the horizontal left to right shows you how likely the scenario is perceived to be. So in that top right quadrant, we see positive, high likelihood scenarios. And in the top right corner, you see corporate tax reductions. We also see in that quadrant less regulation, increased infrastructure spending, and a reduction in repatriation taxes. Repeal of the Affordable Care Act was a little more neutral and balanced, but also seen as likely and positive. And then over on the left, you see tax code simplification, so not necessarily reduction of taxes, but actually removing complexity from the tax code. That's seen as positive too, but less likely in the eyes of our leaders. Obviously, there's going to be differences by company and by industry, but generally speaking, this is where leaders see upside opportunity. Less regulation, less taxes, and more fiscal stimulus. What about the downside? America First scenarios were also graded as likely to materialize, but here the sentiment was more negative in terms of the expected impact on business. They tend to cluster in the bottom right quadrant of our 2x2. It varies by industry, but on balance, these scenarios are seen as bad for business. On the far left, you can see the one scenario that was graded less likely, but also the most negative, the risk of a trade war and higher tariffs. Back over on the right, we see pressure to keep workers in the US, barriers to offshoring, also seen as much more likely, but are seen as somewhat less negative on average. And then finally, restrictions on immigration to the US is seen as both highly likely and negative as companies look to source global talent. And of course, we've seen one example of this already with the executive order restricting entry of citizens from 7 Muslim majority countries. Of course, a lot of controversy surrounding that order, which is now being litigated in the courts. We saw a number of companies commenting or expressing concern with the travel restriction. It's been largely concentrated with tech companies, but also some other companies outside of the tech sector, some car companies and financial institutions as well, commenting on this and expressing some concern. And of course, if you watched the Super Bowl on Sunday night, you also undoubtedly saw some brands very directly or indirectly engaging in a dialogue about inclusiveness and immigration. I'm going to pause here again and get a sense for how you all have been impacted, if at all, by the travel ban. And I wanted to launch a second poll. And the question is, do you have any employees, colleagues, or business partners who have been directly impacted by the travel restrictions associated with the recent executive order? Great, I see votes coming in here. Okay, so for most of us, there's been no direct impact of the travel restrictions, 57%. A quarter of us not sure, we don't know. And for 17%, just under 1 in 5, we're seeing folks on the line who have been directly impacted by the travel restrictions. Great, so just to get a sense for how directly this is impacting us or not, what about communication with your teams about the executive order? I want to launch another poll to ask a question to understand the extent to which you've discussed the executive order regarding travel restrictions with your employees and teams. And we've given you a few different choices here, one no, but then a few different yes choices. So yes, formal communication, that could be either written or verbal. Yes, informal communication, so informal conversations. And then finally, some combination of the two. So again, we'll give folks a chance to fill out the survey, and then we'll take a look and see to what extent this is an active conversation or not. Great. So for most of us, almost 2/3, we haven't had any communication with our teams about the executive order. For about 1/3 of us, we've either had an informal or a formal communication with our teams. I'm curious, for those of you who answered yes. This has been an active conversation, whether formal or informal. I'd love to maybe just get a sense, and again, we can use our chat functionality. What was the nature of the conversation? What was the message? What did you communicate? I'd love to get a sense for what are folks communicating around this issue to teams. Again, you can use your chat functionality, and I'll read out any responses that we get. And again, for any folks who have been having conversations, informal, informal, what's the message that you've been sending to the team? What was the conversation like? Any color you can share on that? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any answers right now, so maybe a challenging conversation to frame and manage. We'll come back to this across our. Oh wait, it looks like we do have one response, which we'll take a look at before we move on. Oh, good. Simply communicated to employees from the banned countries that we would work with them with regard to travel and restrictions to support them. So being very clear around how we could support employees directly impacted by it to support them in terms of travel. Great, thank you. And then another response, just cooler talk about it, general reaction and commentary. Another response, I work with many foreign nationals that were concerned that the ban could be expanded to cover other countries. So working with employees who might be worried that even if they weren't in that initial list, it is going to impact them moving forward. Okay, great. I think that's really helpful to get a sense for the types of conversations and how leaders are framing them with folks who might be impacted by this. Thank you for sharing those perspectives. So how are leaders responding to the risks and opportunities in those scenarios that we looked at? Nearly 80% of leaders tell us they anticipate changing a significant strategic decision as a result of the election. Significant change required to capture these opportunities and manage the risks arising from the election. And you can see on the right the types of decisions leaders tell us they anticipate changing. So on the top right, 39% of leaders anticipate changing financial projections. 31% organizational strategy. So nearly a third of leaders anticipating revising strategy as a result of the election. And then 29% changing capital investments. So big strategic decisions. External partnerships, acquisition targets, go-to-market strategies, people investments, location of offices, earnings guidance, investment in D&I, diversity and inclusion initiatives. And then in the bottom, we have some of the other decisions that were referenced that we saw were related to cash repatriation strategies, changing those or reevaluating them, or managing down OpEx, operating expenditures in international markets. So a lot of change that leaders are anticipating, but many of our organizations are not ready for change. We heard this very clearly from the leaders that we speak with as well. We all know change is hard. We see a great deal of change fatigue in the organizations we work with, and that presents a real challenge for leaders to overcome. We see this on the far left with 83% of leaders telling us they frequently observe employees resisting change. Employees are tired of adapting to successive rounds of change, whether it's organizational change, managerial change, strategic change. So as we think about adapting to this shifting environment, this new set of risks and these opportunities that the Trump administration gives rise to, overcoming resistance to change is going to be critical for leaders. And unfortunately, as you see on the right, this is an area where our organizations generally have some room for improvement. Only 43% of leaders are seen as effective at creating buy-in for change. And this is in the eyes of pure leaders. This data, like the data on the left, comes from leaders. We ask them to tell us how effective pure leaders at their organizations are at creating buy-in for change. So we anticipate making significant changes, but our organizations are not, by and large, prepared to adapt. And that means that as you think about those scenarios, the upside scenarios, the downside scenarios, the key question to ask yourself is, how will you create the flexibility on your team, in your organization, the flexibility needed to adapt in this environment? What are you going to do to enable that? Because as leaders, we can't direct all of the changes that our teams and organizations are going to need to make. It's impossible to do that given all the uncertainty and the pace of change we're confronting. We need to create the conditions for our teams to adapt to changes on their own. So let's talk about how leaders are doing that, how they're positioning their teams for success. And we're going to take a look here at leadership activities, the second part of our agenda. Let's advance one more slide. Focus on talent, not just scenario planning. 72% of leaders say scenario planning has become more important since the election. In fact, it's the top activity leaders think is more important. And it makes sense, right? Given all the uncertainty, the wide range of potential outcomes we're confronting, it makes sense that leaders should plan for different scenarios so we can prepare and move quickly should they materialize. So first, we need a plan for the most critical scenarios that could impact our business. But that's not enough. We can't stop there. Forward-looking organizations are also focused on talent. 65% leaders are telling us it's more important to communicate with employees and stakeholders, and we shaded these in sort of the lighter shade of red here. 56% also indicating that attracting and developing talent are more important, and 53% are focused on managing team dynamics. So our ability to capture opportunities has real talent implications, and I think the quote on the right illustrates this very nicely. An executive from a financial institution is, for the first time since the financial crisis, the organization is making a real shift in posture towards growth, as opposed to shoring up and shrinking their balance sheet. And there's a real talent implication there, right? If you have a whole class of employees who have never operated in a growth environment, how do you set them up for success? How do you make sure they've got the right talent in place? So you need to have the right talent strategy to capture these opportunities. So whether it's having access to the right pools of talent with immigration or offshoring restrictions, or having people in the right locations given shifting tariff regimes, having the right talent strategy is critical. And there's another talent dimension that's very important as well. One of the things that really struck us, our team, as we looked at the scenarios, was that leaders are more concerned about the risk of increased employee division and conflict than the risk of geopolitical conflict. So when we see on the chart the percentage of leaders who believe that each scenario will have a negative outcome. And of course, in the top you see macroeconomic instability. That would be quite negative. But the risk of employee conflict is also top of mind. And I think the quote on the right illustrates this. I'll read it because I think it really captures the issue that many executives are facing. The election has split our teams. We've had many office chats, discussions that become heated and emotional due to the like and dislike of the president-elect. I've heard some employees say that they no longer respect someone due to their political beliefs. Leadership needs to be aware of these issues and provide support or guidance to employees on how to handle the situation. And our perspective here at ExecOnline is that now is the time to really step up your communication and your engagement with your teams if you're worried about the risk of division or conflict that could harm performance. Let's take a look at some of the industry specific issues that we saw. As we looked at responses by industry, there were a few hotspots that popped out, three in particular. First, technology companies, the technology leaders that responded to our survey, what we saw here is obviously reliance on access to global talent pools. Technology firms focus on attracting and developing talent. Trump's policies could impact the ability to offshore talent as well as the ability to attract and retain immigrant talent in the U.S. And many of us have seen technology companies be quite vocal about this. Over the weekend, about 100 of them are in fact challenging the immigration restrictions in the courts right now. Second, financial services. Financial services leaders are focused on adapting to a changing regulatory environment as changes to Dodd-Frank and other financial regulations are anticipated. And while there is optimism for a much less burdensome set of industry regulations. Any significant changes, whether they're positive or negative, are going to require major compliance and change initiatives and expense on the part of the banks. But by and large, optimism around less onerous regulations. Tax changes as well. We saw that in the numbers and the conversations. Could have implications for financial institutions' ability to make use of tax losses that they acquired during the financial crisis moving forward. And then finally, in consumer goods, we see leaders of consumer goods companies are refreshing strategies as they reevaluate assumptions made in 2016. Assumptions made last year about consumer confidence, tastes, and preferences are being reevaluated, especially as we think about differences, for example, in urban versus rural preferences that we saw play out in the election. So a few key industry-specific focus areas that came out of the surveys. And again, what we're seeing here is leaders telling us that these new activities are becoming more important. And it raises a question, if we have these activities that we need to spend more time on as a result of the Trump election, how do we find that time? And as you think about your ability to lead, the scarcest asset you have is really your time. So really critical to think strategically about where you're spending your time so that you can elevate your perspective, pull up from the weeds, and really think strategically about where to focus. And so the seesaw graphic here is really intended to illustrate how you can start thinking about taking stock of where you're spending your time and how to rebalance it. So on the right, we want to be spending more time on strategic leadership activities like refreshing strategy assumptions, communicating with employees, and focusing on the customer. But that means we have to spend less time on things as well. So on the left, spend less time on tactical decision making. Can we delegate more of those decisions to our team? Less time on meetings and performance monitoring and reporting. Now, this is a generic list that we've pulled together based upon the survey responses. Your list might look very different, of course. But the point is really to think about how you're going to reallocate your time to focus on what's important now. And I like to think about it like a helicopter. When there's a lot of uncertainty, we really want to elevate our perspective so we can see the broader landscape. During periods of less uncertainty, we might hover closer to the ground as we look to drive tactical execution. But it's in times of change and transition that we really want to make sure we're pulling up and we're thinking strategically. All right, let's turn to our last section on leadership competencies. And here we're going to talk about the individual skills and behaviors as leaders that become more important in this environment. In an environment characterized by more confidence, more opportunity, and more risk, we can't take a wait-and-see approach. We need to actively place bets and position our teams for success. And to do that requires intelligent risk-taking. And we saw that very clearly when we asked leaders what characteristics, what leadership characteristics are becoming more important in the Trump era. First, on the left, we asked leaders whether using data or intuition was more important to being a successful leader in the current environment. And 68% said that data is more important. So we're hearing we can't just shoot from the hip. We need to analyze data, apply judgment. But at the same time, on the right, 55% say it's also more important to accept risks and not to be overly risk averse. We need to lean into risks if we're going to take advantage of all of that increasing opportunity that we see out there, but do it in an intelligent way. And one very simple rule of thumb, which we've highlighted in the bottom, is to ask yourself the question whether the value of the learning from a risk outweighs the cost of potential failure. If it does, that makes it an intelligent risk to consider pursuing. If it doesn't, one to potentially avoid. So a simple but a powerful rule of thumb. It actually comes from Willie Peterson, who is a business professor at Columbia. He's a faculty director of a couple of our programs here on strategy. Okay, so there's also a tension that we need to manage between collaboration and decisiveness as well. In order to play offense, to take intelligent risks, we really need to balance the tension that we face every day as leaders between the need to move quickly on the one hand, the need, on the other hand, to collaborate with others to get things done. And we see this in our data from our leaders. 61% telling us that decisiveness is more important in the current environment. At the same time, 58% telling us that collaboration is also more important. So there's a real give and take, a real tension here between these two things that we need to manage to be effective. The key thing, we think, to ask yourselves as leaders is, where are you likely to struggle, right? Is it more around collaborating? Is it more around decisiveness? And then just being thoughtful about how your individual preferences, or the preferences of your team, if you're thinking about this on your team, will impact your ability to lead effectively. All right, I want to pause here, and we've covered a lot. I want to see if folks have any questions at this point. We'll open it up for Q&A. Again, you can use your chat box to answer any questions that you might have. If you have any questions, you can enter them in your chat box. I'll give folks a chance to type in any questions they might have. Okay, one question. Can you talk more about the programs that you see on strategy? Sure, I'd be happy, to follow up more here offline. But in the area of strategy, we partner with Columbia University, and we have 2 programs, a 6-week program called Leading Strategic Growth, and a 3-week program called Implementing Winning Strategies. And they're all about how you can craft a winning proposition to drive growth. And it's particularly helpful if you're looking to refresh strategy or align your team around strategy. Thank you for that. See, any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any at the moment. So let me go ahead, and I want to actually close with a little bit of a story. We're at a turning point. Regardless of how you feel about the Trump election, we're living clearly through a tectonic change. Not only in the political environment, but also in the business environment. And it's precisely at times of change like this that winners are separated from losers. It's not during the predictable straightaways, it's during the unpredictable turns that really determines the outcome. And I think the sport of speed skating illustrates this very nicely. I'm sure many of you recognize the skater on the slide, Apollo Ono. Apollo is an American short track speed skater. He was an 8-time medalist competing in the 2002, 2006, and 2010 Winter Olympics. And he really became the face of US speed skating after some dramatic races in 2002. And I'll never forget the 1,000-meter race in Salt Lake City. Ono was leading the pack. And then during a turn around the final corner, Ono and 3 other skaters all fell in a series of collisions. And it was only the last man standing, an Australian skater who was trailing behind at the time, who skated through to win the gold medal. The first actual skater ever from the Southern Hemisphere to win a gold medal. Now, Ono picked himself up, and he still crossed the finish line to win silver, and actually in the next race he took gold. But the point is that turns can be treacherous. They shuffle the established order. And in business, just as in speed skating, there's a real opportunity to pull ahead, but also the risk of collision. And this is really the time when leaders like you can have the biggest impact on your organizations to help them get ahead in the turns. So let me close again with a quick recap of our findings. to create the flexibility that our organizations need to succeed, 3 key action items. First, focus on talent, not just scenario planning. Now is the time to step up communication and engagement with employees. Second, think strategically about how you spend your time. Think not just about what you're going to spend more time on, but what are you going to spend less time on so you can elevate your perspective and separate signal from noise. And then finally, intelligent risk-taking. Think about how to balance that tension between collaboration and decisiveness. Great. Well, thank you all for joining. I hope you found this to be an excellent use of your time today. Please take a moment at the end to fill out a quick survey to let us know whether you found this call valuable. Also, if you'd like any follow-on information, have questions after the call or a follow-on conversation, you can indicate that in the survey as well. Thank you very much for joining us today.